Okay, great. Thanks very much for coming. I have to admit, I'm only a PhD student. I'm not quite the same calibre as some of the other speakers. And I do not mind, as Bob said, if you want to ask any questions, if I'm a bit unclear about anything, please do just stick your hand up or shout out. And I'm very happy to answer any questions. Okay, so a lot of people ask me what I study. And basically, I study cuteness. And when I tell people that, a lot of people look at me and they say sort of, really? Is that a real thing? I guess what I hope to do tonight is to explain to you what cuteness actually is and how we can measure it and the kind of effects it has on our behaviour towards others. Okay. All right, so to start off, let's think about what the characteristic features of the infant face are. So here's a nice example of an infant. So what is it about their eyes? Compared to an adult, do you think they're bigger or smaller? Bigger, yeah. They've got quite big eyes. And what about their forehead? Would you say that's bigger or smaller than an adult's? Yeah. And is it sloping back? Does it stick out? What does it look like? Yeah, it's like a bit of a bump, isn't it? A bit like mine. It sort of sticks out a little bit. And what about their cheeks? What do their cheeks look like? Chubby. Yeah, they've got really, really chubby cheeks. Okay, so does anybody know who this handsome chap is here? Sorry, I'm standing right in front of Dean. Yes, it is. He's a very famous ethologist, so somebody that studies animals in their natural environment. And Konrad Lorenz was the first person who actually studied the infant face from a scientific point of view and tried to really map out what the typical configuration of it is. And he proposed, as you've just said, that the infant face has a high bulbous forehead, large eyes, low set facial features, and chubby cheeks. And he coined the term Kindchen schema, or baby schema, to describe the specific configuration. Okay, so what really underlies this configuration though? A lot of people assume that the infant skull is just a smaller version of the adult skull that just grows over time. But in actual fact, when you're born, the infant skull looks something like this compared to that in adulthood. And I'd like to say this is not a real infant skull. No infants were harmed in the making of this talk. Anyway, if we have a look at these two pictures, you can see that in infancy, the infant skull, it's all about the top half of the head. And when an infant's born, the top half is pretty much, it's not fully grown, but it's sort of almost there. It's quite big. But the lower half, the jaw, is almost non-existent. It's really, really small. And this is probably because, the skull needs to be as small as possible for childbirth. So whilst the brain needs to be there, the lower jaw doesn't really, it's not that essential. And what happens is, over childhood and into adult, the lower half of the face grows. And that is what the difference is, really, between the infant and adult skull. So as you get older, the lower part of your face elongates, and that's when you begin to start to look a little bit older and a little bit more adult-like. Okay, so we mentioned that Lorenz called this the baby schema, and the level of baby schema varies between infants. Like with everything else, some people have a lot, some have a little. But what I mean by this is, basically, let's have an example of an infant with what we might call high baby schema. And this infant, as you can see, is a very typical looking infant. It's got big eyes, chubby cheeks, really low set facial features. Whereas in contrast, an infant that could be said to have a lower level of baby schema might look something like this. And you can probably quite easily see the difference, which is mainly that the facial features are more spread out on the face. It perhaps doesn't have cheeks that are particularly chubby, and its eyes look proportionately smaller. And one thing that stands out perhaps is that this infant looks a little bit older than the other infant. Do you think? And then somewhere in the middle, you get infants that can be described as having an average level of baby schema. And these infants might have some features of high baby schema and some of low baby schema, just any mixture of the two. So for instance, the infant might have large eyes, but perhaps spaced out facial features, or chubby cheeks, but a flat, small forehead. So just any combination of high and low baby schema features. Okay, so you're probably wondering, what's the relationship between the baby schema and cuteness and attractiveness in the infant face? So I think, as most of you probably are aware, cuteness is probably the most common term that we use to describe the infant face. You know, when you see a baby, we usually say, you know, oh, isn't that cute? Isn't she cute? Isn't he cute? And less commonly, we hear the word attractiveness as well. There's some debate over whether cuteness and attractiveness mean the same thing for infants. Most of the literature that's looked at this use the term synonymously as if they're the same thing. And one of the things I look at in my research is, are they really the same thing? But for the sake of this talk, we'll just assume that they mean the same thing, okay, to avoid any confusion for now. All right, so what I'll do now is I'm just going to talk about some studies that have actually been done that have tried to link the baby schema and cuteness together. So the first study that actually ever looked at the relationship between the two was done by Brooks and Hochberg back in 1960. And what they did was they presented participants with very just basic line drawings of infant faces. And what they did was, in the drawings, they varied the height of the eyes so that they were either lower or higher on the face. And as I mentioned just now, low-set facial features are a feature of the baby schema. So in theory, the lower the eyes, the higher the level of baby schema. So the participants saw images that looked like this, with lower set eyes, and images that looked like that, with higher set eyes. And what they did was they got the participants just to rate how cute they thought each image was on, say, a 5-point scale, ranging from not very cute to very cute. And what they found was that the images that looked like this got higher ratings than the images that looked like this or this. Following on from that, Sternglanz and co. in 1977 presented participants with some even weirder looking babies. This was the 70s, this was before, you know, digital and Photoshop and all those things. But what they did was they systematically varied the size and location of each individual facial feature. So as you can see, the eyes are really big here, they're smaller there, they're tiny there. The facial features are high up here, but really low down here. And they presented the participants with a whole array of these very odd-looking pictures. And again, they got them to rate how, I think in this one it was attractive they were, on a sort of 5-point scale, ranging from not very attractive to very attractive. And from this, they collected all the ratings together, and they created an ideal infant face based on that information. And that face looks something like this, thankfully. And as you can see, it's got large eyes, high forehead, and just generally low-set facial features. So basically, it has a higher level of this baby schema. Okay, so moving on from that, Hildebrand and Fitzgerald in 1979, they got a little bit more technical. And what they did was they took pictures, actual real photographs of infants. And I think there was probably about 60 in the study. And they got people to sit down and rate each one of these photographs for how attractive they thought each one was. And using that, they then got an average rating for each image. And what they then did was they measured each one, all these different features. So they measured things like eye width, eye height, the length of the forehead, the width of the mouth, all sorts of things. And they used some horrendous mathematical calculation. And from that, what they found was the infants that got the highest attractiveness ratings were the ones with a combination of features that consisted of large eyes, low set features, high forehead, and larger cheeks. So again, those that were seen as very attractive were the ones that actually had a high level of baby schema. Okay, so Ali et al. Seemed to regress a little bit, and they investigated what they called cephalic profile, which basically just means the shape, the outline of the head. And what they did was they presented participants with these outlines, and they got them to rank them as to how cute they thought each one was. So, which one do you think of these is the cutest? If you can see around me. Does top left? Yeah. Bottom right. Put your hands up if you think it's the top left. And what about the bottom right? Yeah, I think bottom right just about wins it, but yeah, judging by these, I would say this one looks developmentally younger. It's got like a massive bulging profile. And in this study, what they were finding was the one with the most infantile profile would on average get the highest cuteness ratings. Okay, and the last of these studies, which took place about 30 years later, seemed to be a bit of a gap in that research, was done by Glocker and co. And what they did was they took actual images of infants, and using Photoshop, for each original infant picture, they made one with a lower level of baby schema. So as you can see, the eyes are a little bit smaller, the features are spaced out a bit more. And they also made one with a higher level of baby schema. So as you can see, the eyes are a bit bigger, the cheeks are a bit chubbier, and the features are set a little bit lower down on the face. And they presented all of these images to the participants, and they got them to rate each one for how cute they thought it was. And I'm sure you can guess what happened. The high baby schema ones got the highest cuteness ratings. So they got higher cuteness ratings than the unmanipulated ones, who in turn got higher cuteness ratings than the low baby schema infants. So, as you can see, in combination, the upshot of these studies was the higher the level of baby schema in the infant face, the higher the cuteness and attractiveness ratings the face received. Okay, so let's move on now and think a bit about what effect does this baby schema have on our judgments of infants? So how does it influence the way we think about infants? So, it has been found that cuter infants receive more favourable behavioural judgments. And what happened in these studies was participants were presented with infant photos, and they were asked to rate each one on a series of behavioural adjectives such as is a good baby, cries a lot, behaves for its parents. And what they were finding was the infants with a higher level of baby schema were getting more favourable behavioural judgments. So they were seen as crying less or behaving better for their parents. And as well as this, it's also been found that less attractive infants are judged as having more advanced developmental skills. Now you might think, hang on, shouldn't that be the other way round? Well, if we think back to a little bit earlier in the talk, we noticed that less attractive infants, did they look older or younger? Older. They look a little bit older. So because less attractive infants look a little bit older because of their facial features, they're actually often judged as having more advanced developmental skills simply because they look older. However, despite this, less attractive infants are judged to be less competent at performing these same skills. So if you imagine that a less attractive infant was judged as being able to drink from a cup, at the same time they were judged as being less competent at doing this, so they might be seen as, spilling the liquid all over themselves. So it has a strange effect on behaviour, as you can see. So that was more to do with behavioural judgments of infants. But what effect does this baby schema have on our actual behaviours towards infants? So, in a forced choice viewing paradigm, cuter infants are viewed longer than less cute infants. So you might wonder what on earth is a forced choice viewing paradigm. this is what a forced choice viewing paradigm looks like. Basically, like you're doing right now, you sit and you look at a screen with two pictures on it. And obviously, you've got no choice but to look at one or other of the pictures. And what they find is that when you put two together, people will spend more time looking at the cuter image. So if you were to sit here for a while, the chances are you would look at, which one do you think? The one on the left or the one on the right? The one on the left. Probably because you think it's cuter, it's nicer to look at. Okay, so in another paradigm called the Keypress Paradigm, it's been found that participants will exert more effort to view attractive infants compared with less attractive infants. So again, what on earth is a Keypress paradigm? Well, in this paradigm, if you imagine you're sitting at a computer, an infant image will come up on the screen. Now, if you sit and you do nothing, this image will automatically change every 5 seconds. However, you can get involved, and what you can do is you can press keys on the keyboard to change the viewing time. So what happens is that little egg timer to the side will run out every 5 seconds, the image will change. But if I were to press M and N on my keyboard really, really quickly, this egg timer would slow down and the image would stay on the screen a bit longer, and you can look at it a bit more. However, if you get another image up, say a really ugly baby that you don't want to look at, you can press Z next and the egg timer will speed up and the image will change. And what they were finding was that the cuter infants, the people were sitting there pressing to hold it on the screen, whereas those were perhaps a little bit less cute, people either just left it on the screen to progress, or they actually pressed the Z and Next buttons to speed it up and get another infant up on the screen. It sounds really harsh, doesn't it? Very cool. Okay, so it's also been found that participants rate that they would be more willing to take care of cuter infants. And this was a slightly simpler study. Again, all that would happen was the participant would see images of infants and they'd just be asked to rate each one on a scale of how willing would you be to take care of this infant? And people would say, either very willing, not very willing, maybe, these kinds of things. So the cuter the infant, the more willing people were to take care of it. Perhaps a slightly more relevant one to actually, real life, is that participants are more willing to hypothetically adopt cuter infants. And there's been a whole series of studies done that use something called the hypothetical adoption paradigm. And in this paradigm, what happens is, again, people are shown infant images, and they're asked to rate them on several different factors. And one of these factors is cuteness, and other factors include things like intelligence, health, self-resemblance, things like that. And what they find overall is that cuteness is the best they also obviously rate how willing they would be to adopt each infant. And they find that cuteness is the best predictor of how willing people would be to adopt an infant. That's in women. However, in men, there's slightly more self-resemblance is a more influential factor. But in terms of cuteness, again, the cuter the infant, the more willing people would be to hypothetically adopt it.
Were those adoption age people adults, or were they a varied age range?
It's a really good question. Quite often in all of these studies, unfortunately, a lot of them are done in universities with university students. So I would imagine in most of those cases, they would be probably between 18 to 30. So they would, I guess, would be old enough to adopt an infant, but perhaps not very likely to. So it would be very interesting to actually see a study with people who are looking to adopt infants, perhaps a little bit older, married, and see if there's a difference. So that's a very good point. I'm not sure if any studies have actually used people who are looking to adopt infants, whether they'd have a different criteria. They might look more perhaps for health, things like that, to influence their judgments. In terms of actual behaviours towards infants that have been measured, it's been found that more attractive preterm infants receive better treatment from their midwives. And this is a bit of a questionable study, I'm not convinced of this myself, but This conclusion was drawn on the basis that these infants, they gained weight more rapidly and they had shorter hospital stays. And another slightly controversial study, it was found that mothers of more attractive infants engage in more affectionate versus routine interactions. So what happened in this study was a group of research assistants went into a hospital and they sat and they observed, say, a mother, let's say Dean is a mother, with an infant. And they sat, and over the course of, say, an hour or so, they made a list of all the behaviours that they witnessed the mother interacting with the child having. So, for example, perhaps changing the baby, winding the baby, rocking the baby, singing to the baby, all these different kinds of behaviours, and just made a list of them over the time. And then these behaviours were then subdivided into either being affectionate behaviours or routine behaviours. So behaviours such as, singing to the baby, patting the baby, these were classed as affectionate behaviours, whereas things like perhaps winding the baby or changing the baby were classed as just routine behaviours, things that were necessary. And after that, they went away, and another set of researchers saw a photo of each infant and just rated them for how attractive they thought they were. And what they found was the infants that were rated as being more attractive were receiving more affectionate interactions than those that were less attractive, who might get more routine interactions with the mother. And I want to point out these differences are very, very slight. They're not, sort of neglected babies that aren't given any love. It's just a very slight and subtle difference in behaviour. Okay, so basically what these studies find is that overall infants with a higher level of baby schema receive more favourable judgments and behaviours. But again, one thing to remember is, as the lady pointed out at the back, some of these studies, they're done with perhaps, they're done with people that aren't mothers and, perhaps don't have kids of their own or don't want children of their own. So you have to take some of these studies with a bit of a pinch of salt. So if you did them with actual mothers, perhaps like the last one, you might see a slight difference. Okay, so one thing to think about now is, are there actually gender difference in responses to the baby schema? So there exists this general assumption that women are more sensitive than men to infants because they're, well, sort of in evolutionary terms, they're the main caregiver. But actually, there's not really a huge amount of evidence to say that there are differences. It has been found that women smile more at infant images than men. And in this study, what they do is they use something called, I think it's EMG. I cannot for the life of me remember what that stands for. Do you remember? Something, yep. But basically, the participant sits in front of a computer screen and a few different electrodes are attached to the face. And what happens is these electrodes can feel when your facial expression changes. So if you smile, it will register that because it feels you going up. If you frown, it will pull on another one, and the computer registers whether you are smiling, frowning. And what they find is when presented with infant images, women just smile more than men do. But then it could just be that women smile more in general. So, bit of a questionable result. And it's also been found that men exert an equivalent amount of effort to view infant images in the Keypress Paradigm. So remember the one earlier where the infant image comes up on the screen and they can either keypress to keep it on or get rid of it. Men seem to enjoy and are as motivated as women to view infant images. There's no differences there. In terms of sensitivity to cuteness, one quite recent study had some interesting results. And in this study, again, the participants were presented with a pair of images on the screen. And they would just literally ask one question: which is the cuter infant? And it is, as you can probably tell, this is a really, really difficult task. Obviously, I've written the answer on the bottom. This one is less cute. That one's cuter. But if those aren't there, it's actually very, very difficult to tell the difference. And what happens in this study is a whole series of these pairs are put up. And what's been found is that women are more accurate than men at this task. So whilst in general, if you saw different infants, men and women would probably agree on what is and what isn't cuter. When it comes down to really teeny tiny differences in the level of cuteness, women are a little bit more sensitive than men. And what was particularly interesting was they then looked within the female group in this study, and what they found was that women who take hormonal contraceptives, so who have artificially raised levels of estrogen and progesterone, were the most accurate of the female group. This was followed by women who were naturally cycling, and then below that, women who had gone through the menopause, who actually performed at the same level as men. So this would suggest that female reproductive hormones, such as estrogen and progesterone, may actually modulate how sensitive we are to these really teeny tiny differences in cuteness. Okay, so going back though, if you think about all the studies we talked about at the start, in the rating tasks and just usually behavioural judgment tasks, the effects of gender are very, very inconsistent. In some studies they find that women give higher ratings than men of cuteness, in others they find it the other way round, and in other studies there's no difference at all. So where you get things like this, often it means there's either a tiny difference or it just isn't really there at all. So overall, it's not really obvious whether there is or there isn't a gender difference. In terms of sensitivity to cuteness, yes, there might be a tiny one, but when it comes to our actual motivation to look at images, there's not really much of a difference there, which is quite surprising. Okay, so let's think about now, why might we have evolved our responses to the baby schema? Well, going back to Konrad Lorenz, who we briefly mentioned earlier, his theory was that, well, when an infant's born, it is completely and utterly helpless. An infant needs its mother or father for warmth, to feed it, to protect it from any potential predators. So one of his theories was that this baby schema, it elicits caregiving behaviours. So anything to do with caregiving. So, motivation to look after an infant, motivation to adopt it, as we mentioned earlier. One other factor is that Lorenz mentioned is infants are infuriating. They cry all the time, they puke all over you, fill their nappies with goodness knows what, they rub food in their face, throw it everywhere. They are absolutely infuriating to look after. And yet, our reaction to most of these behaviours is, oh, isn't that cute? If an adult did that, if I started crying now, or if I threw up on one of you, or rubbed food in my hair, you'd probably be quite annoyed, wouldn't you? And yet when infants do this, we don't mind. We react with, oh. So another one of Lorenz's theories was that it suppresses aggressive behaviours, and it prevents what's known in nature as infanticide, so the killing of an infant. And if you think about it, abuse towards infants, although it does happen, it is actually relatively rare. If you compare it to many species of animals who regularly sort of maul their animals or, sort of basically kill, young that misbehave, we don't really, commit infanticide a lot. And it would suggest that the baby schema has a kind of protective effect in that way. And if you combine these together, Lorenz's last theory was basically the baby schema, it promotes the parent-infant bond. And obviously for the emotional well-being of a child and just their general development, the parent-infant bond is a very, very important one. So by eliciting caregiving behaviours and suppressing aggressive behaviours towards infants, the baby schema promotes the parent-infant bond and helps the infant develop emotionally in a healthy way. Okay, so in a slightly more scientific route, let's think about what neural activation might underlie these responses that we have to infants. I'll stop now and say I'm not a neuroscientist at all. Elaine Fox, who you might have heard speak a few months ago, she's a neuroscientist and can probably explain this a lot better than I can. But I will just briefly mention perhaps one of the highlights. What's been found is that in response to infant images, there is reward circuitry activation in the brain. So basically, in these studies, what happens is the participants, they sit in an fMRI scanner, and they will typically view images of infant faces. And whilst they do this, the scanner will measure where blood flow goes in their brain. And what they find is there's an increase in blood flow in reward circuitry areas. And basically, reward circuitry, or just reward in general, is something that regulates certain behaviours by inducing pleasurable effects following their performance. So an example of this is when we eat. Okay, so what happens is, you can all imagine, you eat a piece of chocolate, and how do you feel afterwards? You sort of think, yeah, fabulous. You're like, oh, this is great. And so typically, you repeat the behaviour. And you can imagine, it's kind of a reinforcing thing. You eat the chocolate, it's really nice, so you eat more, and you keep doing it. And this is an example of how reward circuitry reinforces behaviour. And this happens with other things, such as the same thing with drinking, copulating, all other things like that. It regulates those types of behaviour that are crucial for our survival. So let's have a quick look at the reward circuitry system in the brain. So there's various different, completely unpronounceable areas, such as the ventral tegmental area, nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex. These are all involved in a big circuit that is known as the reward circuit in the brain. And what's been found during these fMRI studies is that two particular areas become active when you view infant faces. The ventral tegmental area, which is an area full of dopaminergic neurons, which fire when they see an infant face. And these neurons, they project to further ones, such as the nucleus accumbens, which then regulates your behaviour in other ways. So it would suggest that the infant face is... Actually, I won't say that. I'm sorry, I'm losing my thread here. But basically, one interesting thing that's been seen is in mothers, this reward activation is only significant in response to pictures of their own infants. So it seems like after birth, there's some kind of neurochemical change that takes place that makes a mother only sensitive to her own infant. So when she sees her own infant, she's, oh, isn't that adorable? And she gets this lovely sensation of reward. And then she looks at someone else's infant. No, not happening. And this could explain why a lot of mothers think their infant is the most beautiful infant in the world, and everybody else's infant is, you know, not very cute. However, in non-mothers, I'll go forward, the level of reward activation is actually mediated by how cute the face is. So in non-mothers, they find, you know, any infant face, they'll find it cute, they'll look at it, and they'll have this sense of reward. But the level of reward activation, so how much the reward circuits are activated, is mediated by how cute the face is. So basically, the cuter the face, the higher the level of reward, which could explain a lot about the behaviours we mentioned earlier. So like how motivated we are to view cute infant faces. So the cuter the infant, the better the feeling we get. So that might be why we look more at cuter infants, why we're more motivated to view them on a computer screen, simply because we get a greater sense of reward for doing so.
Excuse me, we
Yep.
non-mothers.
Yep.
Now I'm a mother, so would I be a non-mother in that instance?
Oh, no, so sorry, I should have been a bit more clear. What we mean non-mothers is people who haven't had kids yet, basically. Yeah. And so yeah, so if you've had kids, you'll probably find only your own kid cute. Although actually this study was, sorry, the one previously.
And what about dads, Jen?
Yeah, that is a really, really good question. And I would love to know what happens, but for some reason, all of these studies, they only look at mothers, which is really, really silly. There's been one study that's looked at men as well, but they just didn't report any differences, probably because they didn't look for any. They only had a sample size of about 8. So if they just split men and women, it would have been a very good sample size. But I would love to see what actually happens. It would answer a lot of questions.
Have they done anything with grandmothers?
No, as well. I'd really like to see this as well, because basically the studies here, they were typically done, again, on young university students, or the ones that were done on mothers were done on very new mothers. So they had, say, a 2 or 3 month old infant. And at that stage, yes, they're only reactive to their own infant. But then what happens afterwards, as they get a bit older, so what might happen in grandmothers might be perhaps after a while this effect sort of stops and then perhaps again, all infants start looking cute again. We don't know, but I would love to find out what happens. That would be really, really interesting. Okay, so basically, I mean, the upshot of that is that reward activation may be part of the sort of neurophysiologic mechanism that elicits caregiving behaviours. There's obviously bound to be a whole other host of brain regions that are activated and mediate different bits, but we're only at the very, very sort of beginning of understanding what the brain and how that might affect our behaviour. So I guess in the next sort of 20 years, we might get a lot more answers in that respect. Okay, so I'll finish off sort of mentioning a bit about the influence on media. So obviously a lot of people, sort of animation companies like Disney and Pixar, have got wise to the fact that we enjoy looking at cute imagery. And you can all sort of think of examples like Hello Kitty and all sorts of things like that, where, you know, sort of advertising agencies, they really use cute imagery to sort of promote their goods and make us look at them. But a couple of interesting studies include the evolution of the teddy bear. And Hildebrand, the people that did this study, they went back and looked at how the teddy bear has evolved over time. And back in the day, teddy bears actually used to look like bears, adult bears. And I don't know if you can see on this one, it's actually kind of frightening looking. It really looks like a bear. It's got like a pointy jaw, perhaps some fangs.
I like it.
You like it, perhaps you like it. It could probably, you know, be a guard bear or something like that. But over the years, teddy bears have changed, and slowly they've become more like this. And rather than being a bear, it's, you know, pretty much a cub, I suppose. But it's got obviously quite high baby schema features, while this one is clearly an adult with its spaced out features, small eyes, nice long snout. This one's got a very flat face. It's got its features set really low down, bigger eyes in proportion, and a really kind of bulbous head. So it's interesting to see how, you know, the baby schema has sort of been projected into this teddy bear. We enjoy looking at cute things, so the makers of teddy bears have made them more cute. And the same thing has happened to Mickey Mouse. Now, Mickey Mouse used to look like a mouse. He, again, used to have quite a long nose, and he was quite obviously an adult mouse. But over the years, he's begun to look like this. He's got a very flat face, he's got very round ears, he's very cute. And Stephen Jay Gould, who did this study, he actually made a lovely little graph, and over the years he went and he measured all the features of Mickey Mouse's face, and he plotted the level of baby schema on a nice chart. What he found was over the years, at this point he had a low level of baby schema, then over the years it slowly went up to where he looks like today, and he has a very high level of baby schema. So again, they've made Mickey Mouse more cute, so he's more enjoyable to look at. Okay, so basically in conclusion of this whole talk, there is obviously a positive correlation between the baby schema and cuteness and attractiveness ratings. So the cuter an infant, the higher the level of baby schema in an infant, the higher the level of cuteness and attractiveness ratings it receives. And infants with a high level of baby schema tend to receive more favourable judgments and behaviours. Although, as I mentioned, these effects are quite slight. You know, it doesn't mean that we neglect less cute or less attractive infants. It just means that there is a very subtle difference in our behaviour towards them. And this kind of behavioural mechanism, it basically seems to serve to promote caregiving behaviours and helps us basically react to infants in a positive way, so we look after them better and we don't get so infuriated when they cry and scream all the time. Okay, so I don't know where we are time-wise. What kind of time is it?
It's just 22, just gone 22.
Oh, 22. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll spend the last sort of few minutes basically talking a little bit about what I do at the moment. So my research looks basically what happens when an infant is born with a facial abnormality. Whilst it is, I suppose, relatively rare, some infants are born with abnormalities, and examples of these that are quite common in infants are hemangiomas. I'm sure you've probably all seen these. They're just the red marks. They're very common on infants. They might be on the face, arms, or legs. They're harmless, and usually they either resolve on their own, or an infant can have, say, laser surgery to have them removed. Another common one in infants is known as strabismus, which is where the infant has perhaps a slightly crossed eye that goes either inwards or upwards. And again, it's relatively harmless, and it can either be resolved perhaps using patching or through surgery a little bit later on in the infant's life. And also cleft lip and palate, another one that you're probably all familiar with. And again, this is one that's corrected usually during the first few months of life with surgery, usually very successfully. And basically, what I'm interested in looking at is how much do these abnormalities disrupt the perception of cuteness and attractiveness? Because obviously, yes, they would reduce them slightly, but what I'm kind of interested in is just how much, actually quantifying how much it does reduce cuteness and attractiveness levels. And basically, the reason I'm interested in this is how much does this disruption actually affect behaviours towards infants? So perhaps how a stranger might react towards these infants, or how much it's likely to cause perhaps trouble bonding with the mother or father and the infant. So one of the studies I do looks at a bias, and what I want you to do is think just very quickly, is this picture, is this male or female? Just snap judgment. Male, yeah, okay. What's interesting is, actually, this picture is a male and a female stuck together. And if you look at the left half of the image, you would have seen a male. However, if you look at the right half of the image, you would have seen a female. But all of you thought male. And that is because most people show what we call a left hemiface bias. And what that means is that as we look at somebody's face, we tend to look at the left-hand side rather than the right-hand side. And we do that when making judgments of things like age, gender, attractiveness, all these types of things. So after reading about this, my thoughts were, what happens if an infant or an adult even has an abnormality on the left-hand side of the face? Will this disrupt the perception of cuteness and attractiveness more than if it was located on the right, simply because we're looking at the left all the time? So my prediction with that, well, basically my question was, do the abnormalities on the left receive lower ratings than those with abnormalities on the right? So the stimuli I used in this study was, I had a set of infants. Ironically, these pictures were taken in the 1970s, so they're probably older than me now. So I had a set of 48 images. And what I did was, using Photoshop, I put a hemangioma on the left and a hemangioma on the right in the exact same location. And I showed them to participants and got them to rate how cute or how attractive they thought each one was on a 1 to 7 scale. Now, you might think, well, obviously, if they see all the different ones, you know, they're going to get wise to what's going on. So each participant only saw one version of each infant. So they might have seen this one or that one, but not all three. And what I found was that the infants with no hemangioma obviously got the highest attractiveness and cuteness ratings, as you would expect. However, I was expecting there to be more of a disruption if it was on the left-hand side compared to the right. But actually, as you can see, there's no real difference. So it would suggest that wherever the abnormality is located, despite the fact that we might look at it more on the left, that doesn't actually reduce our cuteness or attractiveness ratings anymore. So the location of an abnormality doesn't seem to have any effect on how much it disrupts our perception of cuteness and attractiveness. Okay, so my second question was, do all abnormalities cause an equal reduction in cuteness and attractiveness ratings? Or do some disrupt the perception of cuteness and attractive more than others? So for example, does a cleft palate cause more of a disruption than a hemangioma, or vice versa? So for this study, again, I had a group of unaffected infants, and then using Photoshop, I had made a version with a hemangioma, a version with a cleft lip, and a version with strabismus. And the participants each saw one version of each infant. And what I found was that infants with no abnormality, again, they received the highest cuteness and attractiveness ratings. And infants with hemangioma seemed to get less, but those with cleft lip and strabismus were receiving the lowest ratings. So it suggests that different abnormalities cause a different level of disruption to cuteness and attractiveness. And what's interesting to note is it's the ones that affect the core features of the face that seem to cause the most disruption. So possibly the ones we look at most, the ones we see most in our line of vision, cause a greater disruption. Okay, so after finding this out, that it's, where they are, what I began to wonder was, where do we look when making these judgments of infant faces? So the line of research I'm doing at the moment uses something called eye tracking. Not sure how familiar you are with this, but basically what happens is the participant sits with their head in special rest, and they see a series of faces on the screen, or just any stimuli. And then a little piece of equipment here, it tracks where their eye is looking using a little beam of light, and it measures exactly where they're looking on the screen when they make their judgments. And using this technology, you can end up with things called heat maps. You also get graphs and horrible data, but this is the pretty way of looking at it. And these heat maps show you exactly where people look when making judgments. So in this example here, participants were asked to judge what expression is this man making? Is he happy? Is he sad? And as you can see, people look a lot at the eyes, but they also look down at the mouth in this particular judgment. And on these types of maps, red just means this is the area that they looked at most, and the paler bits are they looked at it, but not as much. Okay, so my question was, where do we look when making cuteness and attractiveness judgments, just in general? And what I found was that basically I was looking to see if, cuteness and attractiveness, do we look at the same bits? Is it the same thing? And obviously from here, you can see that people looked a little bit at the forehead of infants. They mainly look at the eyes and the nose, and they spend almost no time on the cheeks and a little bit of time on the mouth. And there doesn't seem to be any real difference between cuteness and attractiveness judgments. Ooh, yep.
Could that be an issue? You look at a cheek and it's chubby or it isn't, so right, done that.
Mm,
Then
yeah.
you move on to the eyes, which are much more complex, and spend rather more time considering them.
It could be, yeah. If you think about it, when you look at a face, say if you look at my face, for instance, the eyes they're kind of weird compared to the rest of the face. So as you mentioned, the cheeks, they're not very interesting. They're all the same colour. There's not a lot of information there. So they might not be very interesting. Whereas if you look at the eyes, they're kind of, they're white and they're blue or brown. It's actually quite unusual. There's a lot more information there. So as you said, they're a little bit more complex to look at. And the same goes for the nose and the mouth. And that could well be why we look at them more. There's just more to look at, basically. Okay, so again, what I've popped up here is a heat map of where we look when making cuteness judgments and where we look when making attractiveness judgments. And as you can see, people are looking at the interesting areas, so they look at the eyes most, they look a bit at the nose and a little bit at the mouth. And what I then went on to look at is basically, where do we look when there's an abnormality? Do we stare at the abnormality or do we look away from it? What actually happens? So one example we've got here is an example of an infant with no abnormality, and then the same one with a cleft lip, so we can look directly at how much that actually changes our eye movements. So what I found was when there was no abnormality, again, you get this very similar pattern, so they look at the eyes most and a little bit at the nose and mouth. However, when there's something like a cleft lip, you can see that whilst the heat bit here is at the eyes, you can see they do look at the eyes a bit, but it goes down to the cleft lip, so we do stare at the abnormality quite significantly. And the same thing happened when there was no abnormality here. So you can see people look at the eyes, a little bit at the baby's double chin. However, when the infant has strabismus, their focus goes to the affected eye. And in the last example here, you can see we've got an infant with no abnormality, one with hemangioma. Again, you can see that the focus shifts down to the hemangioma. So you might wonder, well, what does this really mean? Well, obviously, when we make judgments of things, if there's no abnormality, we have one set way of looking at them. However, when there's an abnormality, our attention shifts. So this is possibly what's causing our change in the perception of cuteness and attractiveness. We're not looking at the eyes, all we're doing is staring at the abnormality. So in a way, we sort of focus on what's wrong rather than what's right with the face. But in terms of the bigger picture, obviously, how might this affect other things? So, for example, if we were staring at the cleft lip, we might miss judgments about whether the infant's happy or sad, or, perhaps if it's a boy or a girl. It can disrupt all sorts of other things by changing our attention. Okay, so in terms of future research, I'm quite interested in looking at the effect of emotions and how well we remember faces with abnormalities. Do we remember them better simply because there's something that we remember that we stare at? Or do we actually have a harder time remembering them because we're just looking at one area and not looking at the eyes as we do in other faces? And then obviously there's loads of different areas that you guys mentioned as well. For fMRI studies, what happens with grandmothers, or in adoption studies, what happens with actual parents who are really looking to adopt infants. So there's a whole sort of wealth of other studies to be done. Okay, so I think that pretty much sums me up for today. I'd like to thank you all for coming and listening to me whittering on, and also to my supervisors, Tom Fulsham and Debbie Roberson, and Catherine Karaka, who provided me with that very old image set that I use. So thanks again for coming.